September 28, 1976, in the small Ukrainian city of Rubizhne, a boy was born who would grow up to become the most feared heavyweight fighter the world had ever seen. Yet outside the ring, he would remain one of the humblest men in combat sports history. Fedor Vladimirovich Emelianenko entered this world during the final years of the Soviet Union, born to Vladimir Alexandrovich, a welder who worked with molten steel in harsh conditions, and Olga Fedorovna, a schoolteacher who instilled discipline and education in her children from their earliest days. When Fedor was just 2 years old in 1978, his family relocated within the Soviet Union to Stary Oskol, a mining town in the Belgorod region of what was then the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, where life revolved around factories, mines, and the unforgiving reality of working-class existence under Soviet rule. Growing up in Stary Oskol meant understanding that nothing came easy, that survival required strength not just of body but of character, and that the harsh Russian winters were merely one of many tests a young man would face in this industrial corner of the empire. Fedor's childhood was not marked by exceptional athletic gifts or early recognition as a prodigy, but rather by something far more valuable in the long run: an iron will and a quiet persistence that would carry him through every battle he would eventually face, both in training halls and inside the cage where millions would one day watch him fight. At a young age, Fedor began training in sambo, the Soviet martial art that combined elements of judo and wrestling with combat techniques developed specifically for military hand-to-hand combat, a discipline born from the Red Army's need to create soldiers who could fight effectively without weapons in close quarters. Sambo, which stands for Samozashchita bez oruzhia, or self-defense without weapons in Russian, was more than just a sport in the Soviet Union. It was a systematic approach to combat that emphasized throws, joint locks, and ground control, skills that would later become the foundation of Fedor's devastating fighting style. Unlike many future champions who showed early dominance, young Fedor was simply another dedicated student in the gym, displaying no signs that would suggest he would one day be considered the greatest heavyweight in mixed martial arts history. His coaches remembered him not for flashy techniques or overwhelming physical attributes, but for his willingness to train when others quit, to continue drilling movements long after practice had officially ended, and to approach each training session with the same focused intensity, whether he was preparing for a major competition or simply working on basic fundamentals with beginners. After graduating from a professional trade school in 1994 with certification as a licensed electrician, demonstrating the practical Soviet emphasis on technical skills and self-sufficiency, 19-year-old Fedor fulfilled his mandatory service to the Russian Federation by joining the Russian Army, where he was assigned not to a combat unit, but to serve as a military firefighter, a role that would prove formative in developing the calm under pressure that would later define his fighting career. From 1995 to 1997, Fedor served near Nizhny Novgorod, working in conditions where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death, where panic was a luxury no one could afford, and where maintaining composure while surrounded by flames and chaos became second nature, traits that would manifest years later when he stood across from the most dangerous heavyweights on the planet with the same expressionless face that had served him well in burning buildings. During these 2 years in military service, Fedor continued his martial arts training whenever possible, competing in sambo and judo tournaments while fulfilling his duties. And in 1997, the year he completed his military service, he received official certification as a master of sport in both judo and sambo, a distinction in Russian athletics that recognized not just competitive success, but technical proficiency at the highest levels. His parents divorced during this period, adding personal turmoil to the already difficult transition from military service back to civilian life. But Fedor channeled this energy into his training, spending more hours on the mat, refining techniques, and beginning to envision a future where combat sports might offer more than just personal satisfaction. By the late 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Russia was navigating the chaotic transition to a market economy, and new opportunities were emerging in the world of combat sports as Japanese promoters began seeking fighters from the former Soviet republics who had been trained in sambo and other martial arts but had never before had the chance to compete on international stages. In 2000, at the age of 23, Fedor made his professional mixed martial arts debut in Russia, stepping into a ring for the first time as a professional fighter with little fanfare and no guarantee that this would lead anywhere beyond a few local competitions and modest paydays. What happened over the next decade would rewrite the history of heavyweight mixed martial arts and establish Fedor Emelianenko as a name spoken with reverence across every corner of the globe where combat sports were practiced. Between April 2001 and November 2009, a period spanning 8.5 years, Fedor went undefeated through 28 consecutive fights, not merely winning, but dominating opponents in ways that defied conventional understanding of how heavyweight combat was supposed to unfold. In March 2003, Fedor faced Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, the Brazilian jiu-jitsu master who held the Pride Heavyweight Championship and was considered by many to be the most complete heavyweight fighter in the world. A man whose submission skills were so advanced that opponents feared going to the ground with him more than they feared standing and trading punches. The fight took place in Tokyo at Pride's Shockwave event, and over the course of 20 minutes, Fedor systematically dismantled Nogueira, breaking his nose, cutting him open, and controlling him on the ground, where Nogueira was supposed to be unbeatable, ultimately winning a unanimous decision that shocked everyone who had predicted the Brazilian's submission mastery would be too much for the Russian. With this victory, Fedor became the second Pride heavyweight champion, a title he would defend repeatedly and never lose inside the ring. The rematch came in December 2004, and this time Fedor finished what he had started, stopping Nogueira in the first round and cementing his position as the world's premier heavyweight fighter, demonstrating that the first victory had been no accident, but rather the beginning of a reign that would see him face and defeat every challenger the sport could produce. On August 28, 2005, at Pride Final Conflict 2005 in Saitama, Japan, Fedor stepped into the ring for what many still consider the greatest heavyweight fight in mixed martial arts history, facing Croatian striker Mirko "Cro Cop" Filipovic, a former Croatian special police commando whose left high kick had ended the careers of numerous opponents and whose striking was considered among the most dangerous in all of combat sports. The fight was billed as the ultimate striker versus grappler matchup, and the atmosphere inside Saitama Super Arena was electric as two undefeated heavyweights met to determine who truly stood at the pinnacle of the division. For 3 rounds, Fedor and Cro Cop engaged in a technical chess match, with Cro Cop landing his signature kicks and Fedor working to close distance and drag the fight to the ground, where his sambo and judo would give him advantage. The fight went the distance, and when the judges' scorecards were read, Fedor had won by unanimous decision in what he would later describe as one of the toughest fights of his entire career, a statement that carried weight given the caliber of opponents he had already faced and would continue to face in the years ahead. Fedor's Pride reign saw him defeat a who's who of heavyweight talent, including victories over Mark Coleman, Kevin Randleman, Semi Schilt, Matt Linland, and Hongman Choi, the 7'2" Korean giant who outweighed Fedor by more than 150 pounds, but still fell to the Russians' relentless assault in the first round of their December 2007 encounter. Each victory added to the mystique. Each finish reinforced the narrative that Fedor was simply operating on a different level than every other heavyweight in the world, and each stoic, emotionless post-fight interview, where he refused to boast or showboat, only deepened the respect with which other fighters regarded him. What separated Fedor from other dominant champions was not just his winning streak, but the manner in which he won, combining lightning-fast hands that seemed impossible for a heavyweight to possess, with seamless transitions from striking to grappling, from top control to submissions, from defense to offense, all executed with a calmness that suggested he was never truly in danger, even when opponents landed significant strikes or secured momentary advantages. His ground and pound was particularly devastating, raining down punches with such accuracy and power from top position that referees were forced to stop fights before fighters suffered permanent damage. Yet Fedor's submission game was equally refined, with 15 of his career victories coming by way of submission, proving he could win anywhere the fight went. But the undefeated streak, like all streaks in combat sports, eventually came to an end. On June 26, 2010, in San Jose, California, Fedor faced Brazilian heavyweight Fabrício Verdum in the main event of a Strikeforce show. And in a moment that shocked the mixed martial arts world, Fedor made a critical tactical error by diving into Verdum's guard after rocking him with strikes, playing directly into the Brazilian jiu-jitsu specialist's strength. 69 seconds into the first round, Verdum locked in a triangle armbar combination, and after 28 fights without defeat, after a decade of dominance that had seen him conquer every challenge placed before him, Fedor tapped out for the first time in his career, ending the greatest run in heavyweight history. The loss to Verdum began a difficult period for Fedor, as he followed it with additional defeats to Antonio Silva and Dan Henderson in 2011. The Henderson fight particularly brutal as Dan landed a massive right hand that knocked Fedor unconscious in the first round, forcing him to face the reality that time and accumulated damage were catching up even to the seemingly invincible last emperor. These losses, coming in rapid succession after years of dominance, led many to proclaim that Fedor's best days were behind him, that the aura of invincibility had been permanently shattered, and that his legacy, while still impressive, had been diminished by his decision to continue fighting past his prime. But Fedor was not finished. He returned to competition in Russia, winning 4 consecutive fights in various promotions before signing with Bellator MMA in 2016, where he would experience both highs and lows in the twilight of his career, knocking out former UFC champion Frank Mir in the first round, but also suffering knockout losses to Matt Mitrione and Ryan Bader that further fueled retirement speculation. On February 4, 2023, at the age of 46, Fedor Emelianenko stepped into the Bellator cage for the final time, facing current heavyweight champion Ryan Bader in front of an arena full of legends who had come to pay their respects to the man who had defined heavyweight mixed martial arts for an entire generation. The fight did not go as Fedor hoped, as Bader stopped him in the first round with ground and pound. But the result mattered less than the moment itself, as the mixed martial arts community collectively recognized that an era was ending, that the last emperor was finally laying down his crown, after a career that spanned nearly a quarter century and included some of the most memorable moments in combat sports history. Fedor retired with a professional record of 40 wins, 7 losses, and 1 no contest, having defeated 7 current or former UFC champions during his reign, having never once shown fear or hesitation when entering the cage against any opponent, regardless of size, style, or reputation, and having maintained throughout his entire career the same humble, respectful demeanor that had characterized him from his earliest days training sambo in Stary Oskol. Beyond his fighting career, Fedor pursued a political career in Russia, being elected as a deputy of the Belgorod Regional Duma in 2010, while still actively competing, using his platform to advocate for youth sports programs and physical education initiatives that would give the next generation of Russian children the same opportunities that sambo and judo had given him decades earlier.